Hello again, ladies and gentlemen, Kolnar here. Today we're looking at another achievement guide, this one From Dusk till Dawn. And this achievement is part of the Twin Consorts encounter in Throne of Thunder. It requires you to defeat Lulin before you allow Suen to fall below 30% health, and then defeat Suen after Lulin dies to complete the encounter and the achievement. So it turns out this achievement was a bit more difficult than we originally thought it would be. It didn't take too much time to get down, but there are a few mechanics that you do need to be more concerned about when doing this achievement than you would normally. Otherwise, most of it's just like a normal fight. So let's just rewind and we'll get right into it. So when you begin the encounter trying to do this achievement and you're up against Lulin in the first phase, there's very little you can do to directly impact your success for the achievement portion that actually occurs in the final phase. That said, the basic goal here should be DPS Lulin as hard as possible, with the exception of saving things like Bloodlust that you're only going to be able to use one time during the encounter. Otherwise, you want to focus DPS on her more so than you would on Suen during phase 2. The main reason for this is that when you enter the final phase, Suen will already probably be pretty close to 30%. Maybe not quite that low, depending on your DPS, but she'll be close enough that you won't have to do much extra damage to her during that phase when both of them are active. Therefore, the amount of time you spend in the final phase before you can attack Suen is purely dictated by how low you got Lulin's health in this first phase before she disappears. So try to aim to get Lulin as low as possible. There's really no, ceiling or as far as how much damage you should do. So just the lower the better. You'll see here that we don't have our optimal raid, so our DPS is not the highest, but it's around 40% or so I think we get her to before she disappears in the phase ends. And that turned out to be okay. So the other thing to consider for the first phase and the second phase, when you're fighting just one of the twins by itself, is how you utilize the statues for the help. Now, statues will respawn one time during this encounter, which is at the start of the final phase, phase 3, when both twins are active. All statues will repopulate. So you're allowed to use 8 statues in total, but 4 of those have to be in the last phase, and then that means the other 4 have to be somewhere in the first or second phase. In our opinion, Lulin is much easier, not as dangerous to the raid, and generally DPS will be higher on Lulin as well compared to Suen, because Suen likes to move around a lot. She has to be moved by the tanks into various combat positions and all that. So for the most part, you'll want to save your statues for use on Suen's phase. It will help you with survival more and with DPS as well. So as you can see here, during the first phase against Lulin, we don't use any statues. And then as soon as phase 2 begins and we're fighting Suen, then we start to use the statues in order of importance. And this order that we chose based on the same statue order that we'll use in phase 3, but it's just a good idea to get used to the habit of it, whoever's actually handling those. So we used it on the start of phase 2 as well. So as soon as Suen pops, we use the first statue, which is Ox. This is just for survival purposes. Now, if you find that you have DPS issues and you're coming up against a Berserk timer, you can absolutely skip the survival statues and even the healing mana statue as well in this first set of statues, because they don't offer anything in terms of DPS, and instead they actually hinder your damage, because obviously it takes a player going down there to draw them out to actually activate. So if your healing survival is fine against Suen, but you have a little bit of DPS issue, meaning the Berserk timer at the end, with his achievement especially, just don't use the statues at all in this first or second phase. Or if you have to use them, just use the, heal mana one for healer mana regen. And of course the cranes, which will do actual damage. So the basic order that we're doing is ox first, then the tiger, so that gets the 2 survival ones right away. Then we do crane for DPS, so that's what's going on now. And then finally you want to end it with mana healing from Sulong, because if you delay it as long as possible, that will give you the most benefit to your healers, since their mana pool will be lower the further into the fight you are, obviously. So that's the basic order that we used, and you can see it put in practice on Suen here. And then we'll do sort of the same, similar thing when we start the final phase in preparation for the actual achievement portion. All right, so now that we're entering phase 3, you can see that Suen is at about 40%, and Lulin is where we left her around 35% at the end of her phase. So this is about right. Again, going back to the first phase section, you want Lulin as low as possible when she ends her phase, just because, the lower she is, the faster you can kill her in this section. But for Suen, it doesn't really matter as long as you do appropriate damage to get her within range of 30%. Don't stand on fire like I'm doing here, by the way. I don't even notice for ages. Anyway, so Suen at 40% going into this phase is about right. You want her high enough that you can do tank damage and miscellaneous damage without accidentally pushing her below that 30% mark, while the remainder of your DPS and your other tank finish off Lulin, since you cannot get Suen below 30% for the achievement. So we basically have most of our DPS immediately switch to Lulin, and this allows our tank to just attack Suen and get her lower in preparation for the final phase. Now, the important thing is that timing of the statue use for helping your survival in this final phase. And this is really no different than if you're doing this fight normally, except that obviously once Lulin dies, things get a little more dicey. But for the most part, you will find that Lulin's tidal force is actually more dangerous than just when Suen is by herself, assuming you've saved up your DPS cooldowns. So let's just take a look at that real quick once again. So right as the third phase is beginning and both twins are spawning, we have our statue controller activate the Ox statue, so that that buff will be active at the start of the phase, and therefore when Lulin does her first tidal force attack, whatever. So here comes tidal force, and Ox hit us about 5 seconds prior, so that's exactly what we want. We want that hit point buffer to allow us to not have to use active mitigation abilities to survive tidal force hits, because there's going to be another tidal force unless you happen to get Lulin really low in the first phase. Then most likely you'll have to deal with a second tidal force at some point before she dies. And so you want to be able to use the other survival statue, the Tiger Celerity, when that tidal force is coming up the second time. So for now, we're not using any statues. You don't want to use the cranes on this one, because it will do a lot of damage to Suen and probably push her over that 30% mark that you're trying to avoid. So be careful of that. Just save cranes. But when your tidal force is coming up in 15 or 20 seconds, depending on how long it takes your statue player to activate it, send them down and have them activate the Tiger Celerity. So our Druid is doing that, and she just activated, and there you see tidal force just started. So now, with tidal force active, you can see the waves are completely dodgeable. They're very slow, so this has the same sort of effect. You don't need an active cooldown to survive this damage, and you can just dodge them. Don't worry about meleeing her too much if you're a melee DPS during that phase, because obviously survival is more important. And yeah, and then by the time she would do her third tidal force, she should be dead. Your DPS is probably not going to be that low. So once lulin is about to die, then you'll be getting ready to transition and push Suen down as fast as possible, because this is where the sort of soft enrage kicks in that Suen's damage output will continue to rise as the phase continues. So as you kill lulin, you should try to have Suen around 31 or 32%. So she's as close to that 30% mark as possible without pushing over. You'll also want to try to have an ice comet active when you start the phase. This will allow you to keep Suen stacked in it just as you're starting to DPS her, and this will get her stack count for the AE damage from Blazing Radiance as low as possible. Preferably just reset it down to 0 or 1 or whatever. Now, of course, the other thing you want to do is use the crane statue immediately, because you saved it till this point for a reason, as well as blow all your DPS cooldowns. Try to time your bloodlust so that you can have it active when the statue player, the player that's phasing to do the various drawing, is in the same phase as you, because otherwise they'll miss the bloodlust. But if you have two forms of bloodlust, then you can just do one right away and then have them get the pickup later on when they're back outside. Otherwise, your main goal is just to burn her down before the Blazing Radiance stack gets too out of control. But the good news is that the rate that this damage increases is quite low. So as you may be aware from normal, or maybe not, doesn't really matter, she gains a stack every 2 seconds, as well as does damage at the same time. And this does 35,000 damage every 2 seconds to everyone in the raid, but also applies a stacking buff to her that increases the damage by 5% per stack. So for our raid, we finished Suen with about 28 stacks or so of Blazing Radiance. And it turned out that the damage from this was very low. Just not much happened at all. Healers did not have to use survival cooldowns or healing cooldowns of any kind. And the boss just pretty much fell over. So the basic idea, of course, is burn everything you've got to finish her off before the damage gets too high. But that said, it takes a long time for the damage to actually get dangerously high. So at 28 stacks, that's doing about 84,000 damage every 2 seconds to everyone in the raid. So about 42,000 per player, or 420,000 per second to the raid. Now, by comparison, if you look at something like the Megara fight, which obviously you've done if you're doing the achievement for this fight, the damage on the raid at the end of the fight on the last couple rampage sections is way higher than 420,000. It's around 700, 750,000 DPS at the end. So, by comparison, Megara is a lot more damage. So, to actually take that much damage during this final phase, you can look at the calculations here, and we can just figure out really quick how many stacks and how much time that would take to reach that point. So the basic calculation is that the total raid DPS is tick damage times the modification that the stack count is giving you, basically. And then, of course, divide by 2 seconds, since it's seconds per tick, and then multiply by the player count. So you can see that we get 750,000 equals 35,000 times 1 plus stack count times 5% per stack divided by 2. And if you simplify it, you get the next section. And if you solve for stack count, you get about 65.7 stacks, which, since it's every 2 seconds per stack, translates into a little over 130 seconds that it would take you to take enough damage from Radiance to be equivalent to the Megara damage on Rampage. So obviously it's pretty low, is what I'm trying to say. And to take 131 seconds on this final phase, you'd have to have 500,000 DPS or lower, basically, which is an absurdly low number. I don't think that'd be possible these days. So basically, if you've been able to get to normals to this point, you should easily meet the DPS requirement to finish this final phase before it's a problem. So really the DPS check will occur in the prior phases, basically in how low you get Lulin before she phases out in phase 1, and of course how fast you can kill her during phase 3 when Suen and lulin are active at the same time. So that really covers everything, I think. It's pretty easy achievement. It's mostly just doing the fight on normal with this final little bit, obviously, where you save things up and push her down. So good luck on From Dusk Till Dawn. And as always, thanks for watching and subscribing.